Well, friends, this story that we hear today may sound familiar. And I don't mean like you've heard this story read again and again and again, this exact story of the announcement, the annunciation to Mary about the conception of her child. I'm talking about just before this. Just before this, last Sunday, what did we hear about? We heard about Zechariah, right? Having an angelic visitor come to him while he was in the temple doing his priestly duties. And him being afraid, him being frightened by that presence with him. And then that messenger saying, don't worry, don't be afraid, because I'm bringing you some good news that you're going to have a child. Well, your wife is going to have a child. These are very similar stories, right? They're following, it seems the author of the Gospel of Luke, our evangelist, is following a theme here, following a pattern of arrival of an angel, the one being visited, being shocked, being afraid, being perplexed. The visitor, the messenger, that's what angel means. A messenger calming them down, giving them the good news that you don't need to be afraid. You're going to have a baby. And then Zechariah says, well, how is this going to happen? Because we're old, right? Remember? We can't, Elizabeth is not capable of having a child, of having a baby. I'm old too. How will this happen? Well, Mary asks a question, but she's young. So she asks, how can this happen? Because I have not, as Jack read for us today, known a man intimately. She's a virgin in this story. How can this happen? We have parallels happening here. And then the messenger goes on to say what's going to happen, what will happen, what sort of a child this one will grow up to be, what they will do, both John the baptizer who is coming and Jesus who will be the Christ, who is the Messiah, who will be the Son of God. We hear his story there. And then Zechariah is given a sign, right? He won't be able to speak. And Mary is given a sign. Your relative, Elizabeth, even in her old age, is with child. She too is going to have a baby. And then Elizabeth, Zechariah comes out, and Elizabeth, she's pregnant. It happened. And for Mary, she gives her consent. It says, here I am. These stories are paralleling one another. So let us recall and to remember then that these stories are about their meaning. Did the author write these stories in parallel because that's the way they happened? If we had been there, we would have been able to record this announcement to Zechariah and this announcement to Mary and been able to watch them parallelly and thought, wow, that's weird. They're pretty similar. I think it's more likely. Scholars think it's much more likely. Jesus' contemporaries and those who were alive at the time of the writing of this gospel and when these stories were being shared just like around in gatherings orally, they would not necessarily have been taking these stories literally either, but focused on what they mean. So what does this mean that these two stories are paralleling each other? And what does it mean that they have some slight differences? Well, one of the biggest differences is that Zechariah and Elizabeth are aging, right? They're not in the place where they can have a child. And that Mary, at the very beginning, twice, is referred to as a virgin. And just in case it didn't come through to us in those two statements, she asks, how is this possible? I've not been in any sort of a situation where I could actually get pregnant. That she's a virgin. There's a difference here, right? Zechariah we talked about last week, how they are drawing on, that author is drawing on the Hebrew tradition. How do you proclaim that an amazing human being has been born? How do you signify that the way that one lived their life showed forth the divine, brought forth good into the world in an exceedingly powerful way? How do you show that? You show it by women who were not able to conceive, aging, and then conceiving. Again, that happened in the case with Abraham and Sarah. It happens with Hannah, whose song we'll hear, a version of her song, and an adaptation of her song we will hear in a couple of weeks as Mary's song. So biblical scholars Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan think that for the author here, John the Baptizer is the end of the Hebrew Scriptures, of what you might call the Old Testament. He is an end of an era. And that with Jesus something different, something new is beginning. We get the start of the New Testament, and we have a virgin birth that you don't hear of in the Hebrew texts. But you do hear about it in the broader culture, in the wider context. There was another at that time. At the time of Jesus' birth, at the time of when Matthew and Luke were conceiving of these stories or hearing these stories about a virgin birth, there were stories about virgin births, and in particular one being referenced to a leader at that time, Caesar Augustus. He too was referred to as a son of God. And stories developed. Stories were told that, what do you know? He had a divine conception as well from a virgin, just like some before him. You think of Alexander the so-called Great. There's a story about him in that same vein. So what's Luke doing here with these differences? Or the author, whom we'll call Luke because we don't know their actual name or the community's name. What is Luke doing here? Paralleling John and Jesus. I mentioned this briefly last Sunday. That it's clear that John had a presence. John was an impactful personality. And that Jesus is shown as a follower, a disciple of John's. And the gospel writers were trying to distinguish Jesus in some way, to set him apart and perhaps to show John as being surpassed by Jesus. As I mentioned last Sunday, what is more miraculous? What else could you think of but a birth from aging parents who have never had a child, but a virgin divine conception? And they're able to pull, like I said, from the broader context, the broader culture. So not only is Jesus surpassing John, but Jesus is being shown on par with Caesar Augustus, or the Caesars that followed, because those stories continued to be told. They continued to be proclaimed as sons of God, divine entities in themselves. So perhaps that's what Luke is trying to address here. I think that's what the writer is trying to show forth here. They're trying to say something about these people, in particular about Jesus, who he was, who they experienced him to be, who his earliest followers encountered him, came to know him to be. Through his life, through his ministry, through his actions, through his words. How do you say that? How do you show that? With a miraculous conception. But I think there is more that we can learn, that we can draw from these verses than only what perhaps the writers invited us, were sharing with their earliest audiences. Because I do believe that God continues to speak, that the Spirit continues to move, that we can learn even more from these stories, whether somebody intended it to be there or not. So I'd like to highlight on another of those parallels. That piece about being afraid, right? Do you notice that? The angel, the messenger, both to Zechariah and to Mary says, do not be afraid. They're going to be asked to do something big, something important, something meaningful. And indeed, this phrase is repeated in chapter 2 when the angels appear to the shepherds, right? They're afraid, they're terrified. And that same assurance comes to them. Do not be afraid. Do not fear. That's a powerful message. That's a message shared over and over and over again in scriptures. And I think it's one that we may need to hear today. Do not be afraid, our Mary is told. And what is it that gets her over her fear? To get to that place where she stands up and she says, I'm here. Here I am. Just like prophets before her who had been called by God and had said, no, I can't do this. It's too hard. I'm the wrong one. You have the wrong person here. What got her to that place? What might get us to that place? To doing something when we might be afraid, when we might be scared, when we might be fearful. What can get us there? Well, what got Mary there, at least in my reading of the text, was a reminder from that messenger that the divine was with her. God was with her. God had some things that they were going to do with her all along the way. She wasn't alone. But that sort of ephemeral, spiritual presence, it can be hard to feel sometimes, right? Have you ever been in that place where you're like, okay, God is with me, but you still feel really alone? The angel, the messenger goes on, and what does Gabriel say? But you have family. You have a kinswoman, a relative who will be going through this with you, a tangible human being. The children reminded us, we need friends. We need people. You have people, Mary, who will be with you through this challenging time. Even though you are afraid, you are not alone. And after hearing those words, after experiencing those messages that she was with God, that God was with her and would remain with her, that Elizabeth, a flesh and blood human being, was with her, was part of her community of care, of support. She didn't respond with fear. She didn't respond with hesitation or timidity. She said, "Here I am. Let's do this thing." Friends, I think this story can speak to us today, especially in times when we are afraid, in situations where we are deeply fearful. Maybe not because a shocking-looking angelic figure has appeared to us, but because of the situation in which we find ourselves. Whether that be as an individual, a personal experience we are going through that is scary, that is hard. Whether it be the community, the situation that's happening in the world around us that makes us feel afraid. I think we can do well. I know I am served well by remembering, by opening myself to the experience, to the presence of God that is always right here with me, that is right here with you. And as Mitchell always says, as we begin worship, to look to your left, to look to your right. He doesn't say to look behind and to look forward, but to look around you. To pick up your phone. To remember the community that is here with you. You have people. If you have no one else, you have us. You have your First United family. To be reassured, to be bolstered, and to be reminded that you don't face any of this alone. To me, that's a powerful message. To me, that is inspiring. To me, that is emboldening. That emboldens me to take the next step, to claim I am here and to act, to embody hope, to incarnate peace, to spread joy and love, because I'm surrounded, I am connected. Friends, those are some of the pieces I've been contemplating. The thoughts that have been going through my mind this week as I've encountered this text that you've read again and again and again, or heard over and over and over. What are you hearing? How is this connecting with you? How is that the Spirit that is here with us, how is it moving you? What message are you being invited to hear? How is the divine nudging you? I'm going to give you a moment to reflect, a moment for prayer, a moment for meditation, to consider how God is embracing you, inviting you, and strengthening you, and perhaps calling you in this moment. Friends, let us be together now for a time of quiet. Let us be together now for a moment of pause.